for that introduction. It's lovely to be here in Madison, Wisconsin, to talk about this second book project. It's great to be invited by graduate students, although it makes me feel kind of old. And it's also wonderful to be here with all of you. So this is the second book project, which is very much a work in progress. So I look forward to any comments and critiques that you have, because it's still at such an early stage that I can still, I think, incorporate a lot of feedback. So secularization with Hindu characteristics. So let me just start with a theory that I'm sure you have all heard about, secularization theory, or the secularization theorist. This is one of the oldest theories that we have in social science. Not just in political science, but sociology, economics. You have a lot of scholars from these fields talk about secularization. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If I had to kind of distill it into one sentence, I would say secularization is the idea that modernization weakens religion. So then you will immediately say, well, what is modernization? Which is a good question. So we think of modernization as being industrialization, urbanization, and rising levels of education and wealth. So as a society becomes more developed and more modern, people tend to become less religious. Maybe via industrialization, new kinds of jobs have an effect on your thinking, or urbanization, moving to a city that is more diverse. Maybe you come across different kinds of religions and realize your religion is not the most unique. Rising levels of education might make you realize that some of your religious beliefs, like in astrology, for example, might not be scientific. So the idea is that modernization weakens religion. So this is a very old theory. For those of you in sociology, as I'm sure you know, it's a very controversial theory. Not a lot of people believe in it these days. If there's one part of the world where secularization does seem to have been correct, it would be within Western countries. I know this is a little bit hard to see. By Western here, we mean kind of Europe and their settler colonies. So this is a graph of religious affiliation by decade of birth, so different kinds of birth cohorts in Great Britain. And so what you see here is that every birth cohort, so here are millennials at the bottom, like 20, it looks like around 30% of them have some kind of religious affiliation. So you can see every birth cohort tends to be a little less religious than the one that preceded it. Similar kind of graph for Australia. So if you look at people who are kind of on the cusp of being millennials here at the very end, only about 65% say that they have a strong religious affiliation. Similar for our neighbors in the north, Canada. So again, it looks kind of like Australia, 65% of millennials. And even in the United States, which is always considered kind of a more controversial case, and a case that is supposedly an outlier for secularization theory, you can see millennials in the US are like quite godless. Only around 30% of them say that they have strong or somewhat strong religious affiliation. So I was really interested in this literature. I really kind of enjoy learning about religion, but one thing that annoyed me was that I kept reading about the same countries over and over again, and I was just tired of reading about the United States in secularization or the UK in secularization. So I wanted to start thinking about this in a more kind of expansive sense. So the two really big puzzles I'm trying to deal with in this book are, number one, this theory, secularization, which sometimes theorists talk about in this really broad, universal way. They kind of suggest it applies to all countries everywhere. Not all secularization theorists say that, but they kind of hint at the idea that this is a universal theory, but they don't actually study a lot of different cases. They just study the same cases over and over again. So does secularization theory apply outside the Western world, and more specifically beyond the Abrahamic religions? Those are the three great monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which all kind of date from the prophet Abraham. They build on top of one another, these religious traditions. So a lot of secularization theory really focuses on these religions, but does it apply to other religions? And then a second topic is how could secularization affect political behavior? When I first mentioned this topic to my department chair, I was really only interested in the first question, and he was like, but that's a sociological question, and you're a political scientist, so where is the politics in your book? And so I'm like honestly not as interested in this question, but I guess I have to study politics if I'm in political science. So how might changing attitudes affect political behavior? I'm not really going to talk much about that today. I'll really kind of focus on the first question. So does secularization theory apply outside the Western world beyond Abrahamic religions? So the case I'm going to be talking about today is Hinduism in India, which I will say is an interesting case for two reasons. First, because it's relatively understudied in this secularization literature on secularization theory, but also because I think it is it should be considered a crucial case for secularization theory. We spent a lot of time talking about whether the US fits this model, but really whether India fits the model, I think, is a more important question. So why is India and why is Hinduism, why are they such important cases? So I've never met any scholar of India who has suggested that it's not a religious country. I know sometimes we might kind of overstate how religious it is, or we think about it as some kind of essentialist religious quality, but by almost any standard, it is quite a religious place. According to the census, you have 900 million people who self-identify as Hindus, and there are over 1 billion Hindus in the world. So as you can see, the majority of them live in India. And then Wynne Gallup in 2012 had this poll where they just asked for the percentage of the population in a country that call themselves religious, and India ranks 18. Now, there are lots of problems with this question, but it's kind of a very blunt measure. So you could definitely say it's one of the most religious countries in the world. And at the same time, it's also a very fast developing country. So from 1999 to 2015, you had the world's second highest growth rate behind China, over 7%. And all of the mechanisms of secularization that theorists have talked about for a very long time are occurring in India right now. So rising levels of urbanization, about 30% of Indians now live in cities, census designated urban areas. Per capita income has risen considerably, especially since 1991, where you saw the Indian economy liberalize and you had market reforms. And then you have some of the first compulsory education laws. So if secularization theory is right, then we should see an effect in India, because these two things should be in tension: a deeply religious country and a country that is very fast developing. So, like I said, this is a book project, so there are lots of moving parts, and I won't be able to talk about everything today, but I wanted to kind of give you the 30,000-foot view of what the book will look like when it comes out either 2 years from now or like 25 years from now. Depends on how I feel on any particular day. So the first part of the book is really kind of concept building and thinking about measurement. So what does it mean to be religious in Hinduism? It's like the $64 million question. It's a very, very hard question. So my wife is in religious studies, and I once asked her, I said, what would religion mean in Hinduism? And she said, everything. And I said, that doesn't help me, because I can't code everything. So I used ethnographic fieldwork to try to develop a measure of Hindu religiosity. So I'll talk a little bit about this today. The rest of the project is a mixed method research design. So a quantitative analysis includes surveys in 2 states in India. And so I looked for like maximum variation. So I just looked at the Human Development Index, and I picked one of the states at the lowest end, which is Bihar, and then one of the most developed states, which is Kerala. So it would be called a diverse cases research design. And then within each state, 900 or like closer to, as I'm expanding the work, closer to 1,000 respondents in each state using a stratified random sample. I'll talk a little bit more about the survey process later. Qualitative field work, so I was in the field roughly half the time with the survey enumerators, so I would report my observations about how people responded while being surveyed, my observations about kind of village life, or what a particular neighborhood was like. If anyone struck me as particularly interesting, so if anyone said, I don't believe in God, for example, I would do a follow-up interview with that person. Out of 914 people, only 2 said that they did not really believe in God. So those are unique respondents. And then I also separately did ethnographic fieldwork with urban families because I didn't feel like I was capturing the one group that is really supposed to secularize, which is what we call India's new middle classes or the aspirational middle classes. So I lived in a more of a middle class neighborhood in Patna, Bihar, and in Kochi in Kerala, and got to know different families and interviewed them and other members of their families. So what's in red is what I'm going to really talk about today. I haven't finished my survey in Kerala due to the monsoon, which has been particularly bad in the state the past 2 summers. So it's mainly going to be about Bihar. So if you're a Bihari or like Bihari politics, then today's your day. So let me just start with really part 1 of the project. When I first got to India, October 2017, on a Fulbright to work on this project, I really started with how do we measure Hindu religiosity? So there are a few issues here. So first is translation. Okay, what's the term that we're using for religion? And then what are the measures that we use? So the term that we use in Sanskrit or in Hindi is dharm, which, this is a quote from Barbara Aldrich, a religious studies scholar. She says you can translate it as religion, but also law, duty, norm, social usage, right conduct, morality, justice, or righteousness. It can mean all of these things, individually or collectively. So very often people use the term to me in conversation to just basically mean morality. They say this person is dharmic, which means they're a moral person, but that doesn't really necessarily mean anything about Hinduism. So you have translational difficulties. And then in most of the literature on secularization, the 2 measures that we use in surveys are, do you believe in God, and do you go to religious services? That is, do you go to mosque, do you go to temple, church? The problem in Hinduism is you don't have to believe in God. Most people do, as my survey showed, but you don't have to. And you have probably met people who start off by saying, I'm an atheist, but I'm a Hindu. So for them, Hinduism is kind of their cultural community. It's kind of divorced from their religion. So you don't have to believe in God, and some of the orthodox schools of Hinduism were atheistic, didn't really talk about God very much. So you can't really use that survey measure. And then a good Hindu or a pious Hindu never has to go to temple. It's not compulsory. Most people have what's called a puja shelf in their house and never leave, right? So there were plenty of women who said, I never go to temple because I have a temple kind of in my own home. So again, that metric doesn't really translate to Hinduism. So my argument is that we need some other way of thinking about how to measure Hindu religiosity. So I'm not Hindu. I don't study religious studies, so I'm certainly no expert on this. So my plan was that I wanted to go to villages in India. This is one of the villages I studied, right outside Patna, which is the capital of Bihar. And I wanted to basically ask Hindus, in their own words, kind of, can you describe your religion? And the way I did this was, I picked 2 villages that were extremely similar, and I randomized 2 versions of a survey, both across and within the villages. In one version of the survey, you might be asked, what are your religious activities? And I gave all the responses from the National Election Study in India and the World Values Survey. In another version of the survey, an enumerator would come to your house and say, what are your religious activities? And it would be an open-ended question. So you could respond however you wanted. And the responses, as you can imagine, were extremely different. So I'll just give you one example here for religious rituals. Okay? So on the left side, you have the closed-ended version. These are all the responses from the National Election Study and the World Values Survey. So I asked people, do you give religious donations? You can see most people say they do. Do you do puja, that is worship of the deity? Do you visit a temple? Do you consult a pundit about auspicious timings? Do you fast? You can also see in the survey there's a lot of satisficing. A lot of people just say yes to everything. Whether or not that's truthful is a different question. But in the open-ended version, when I asked people, what are your rituals, the #1 response was, what's a ritual? And people had not really thought about that term. And if you go into a Hindi dictionary, there are 11 terms listed under the word ritual. So it's not clear which one really applies to what they call a ritual. So it's a vocabulary issue, right? So you can see the only really similar thing across these 2 versions of the survey is puja, 75% roughly. But a lot of the other things, like visiting temple, only 16.3% of people said that that was a ritual. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't go to temple. It might mean that they just don't consider it a ritual, or they don't know what a ritual is. But other things that they mentioned, going to festivals, attire. So men would mention, I wear the tilak, which is the red sandalwood paste mark on the forehead. Women would mention wearing anklets or putting colored dye on their feet. And a bunch of people said, especially younger people, they said, obeying my parents and my ancestors is a religious activity, which, like most Christians, I wouldn't expect to see that on an open-ended version of a survey of Christianity, right? But obeying parents and ancestors is important. So what I did was, first I went through and saw what are the similarities, because that means so something like puja is obviously important to everybody. And then what are the other open-ended things that they mentioned that I should put on a survey questionnaire? So you want to ask questions about like community and community norms. You want to ask about like fasting. You want to ask about maybe attire. And so then I developed the centerpiece of all this is a 14-point questionnaire about Hindu religiosity. And one thing that I wanted to do was, once I developed the questionnaire, I sent it to a bunch of different religious studies scholars, and I said, what do you think about this? And most of them were like, I would never do a survey. I would do ethnography. But if you're doing a survey, I don't like this question, or maybe change the wording. So they gave me some feedback. So let me show you the questions, and then you can kind of think about how well this is actually capturing Hindu religiosity. So 14 questions, each one is an agree-disagree question on a scale from 1 to 4. So 1 is completely disagree, and 4 is completely agree. What we do is we went into a particular neighborhood, and we would ask people first, do you agree or disagree with this question? And then they would say yes or no, and then we would say, okay, so you said you agree, do you completely agree, or are you kind of unsure? And then that's the difference between like a 3 and a 4 response. So here are some of the questions I asked. The first 4 questions are kind of about community norms and about just Hindu identity. So I asked, do you agree or disagree? I would marry someone who is not Hindu. Hinduism is a very exclusive club. You are born into it. It's unclear whether you can even convert to become a Hindu. But that's kind of similar to Judaism, right? It's an idea that you are kind of part of a chosen group. So usually Hindus marry other Hindus. I would marry someone from a lower caste. Usually Hindus marry someone from the same caste. It is important for me to teach my children about Hinduism. So my assumption here is, if you say, no, it's not important for me, then religion is probably less important to you than someone who answers the question differently. Right? If you say, yeah, of course I can marry anyone from any religion, then you are doing something that's quite different than most Hindus, so I would say you are more secular. Right? So that's kind of the intuition here. This question is reverse coded to make sure people are paying attention. Okay? So I said, it does not bother me when people make fun of Hindu rituals. And the cool thing about Hindi is you can put the not at the end of the sentence, right? So you say like, so essentially you're saying like, it bothers me when people make fun of Hindu rituals, not, and people are kind of like nodding, and they're like, no, it would bother me, right? So that way you kind of know that they are, in fact, paying attention, right? So if you really value your religion, you don't want people making jokes about it. Right? It's very serious to you. The next 5 questions are about rituals. So fasting is also, I'm putting this in here because women tend to fast more than men. So you want to kind of make sure you have gender-inclusive questions. So fasting is important to receive God's blessings. Do you agree or disagree? It is auspicious, like there's this idea, this normative idea in Hinduism. Certain things are auspicious, certain things are inauspicious. So it is auspicious for children to do the mundan, for parents to do the mundan ceremony for their child. That's when you shave a child's head at usually like 2 or 3 years old, to get rid of all the sins of the past life, technically. And so spending time in Bihar, this is a life cycle ritual. Most people said this was one of the more important rituals in their life. So I thought I should ask about this. I asked about darshan, which is the sight of the divine or the deity, which is a big part of Hinduism. The best part of the Chhath festival is that I get to buy new clothes. So this is the biggest Hindu festival in Bihar that celebrates the sun god. So festivals, the interesting thing about festivals, they can be secularized. could go to a festival for religious reasons, or you could go because you wear new clothes and you think it's fun. So I kind of am trying to draw the distinction there. So very often you'd have like young kids who are like, yeah, like I love getting new clothes. That's what the festival means to me. And then their parents are like, that's not what the festival's about. You're supposed to care about the ritual. So there you see a kind of difference in religious like motivation. This final question is about purity or pollution. There are certain times in Hinduism in your life when you are ritually polluted. So I actually divided this question up by gender. So for men, I said, I would not enter a temple if I just lost a family member. So if someone in your family dies, usually for about 13 days you are ritually polluted. So you're not supposed to go into a temple during times when you're polluted. And for women, the question was, I would not enter a temple if I were menstruating. That's the time you're not supposed to go into a temple. Just to be clear, I had a gender balance survey team, so it's women asking women about this. No men were talking about menstruation. That would have been problematic. So these questions are about rituals, and then the last set of questions are about beliefs. Sometimes people say beliefs don't matter in Hinduism, you can believe whatever you want. I think there's some truth to that, but I also do think there's certain beliefs that are quite normative within Hinduism. So the belief in God is pretty widespread. So I believe that God blesses me when I do puja. Another reverse coded question, I don't need to consult with the astrologer pundit before fixing a wedding date. Everybody does this. You have to find an auspicious day for your wedding. If it's an inauspicious day, you will get divorced or you will have an unhappy marriage. So I asked people, would you consult with the astrologer? And then we asked at the end, like, would you not do that? And people are like, no, you must consult with the astrologer or the pundit. One belief that is quite different from the Abrahamic religions is the belief in the evil eye, that at certain times in your life you are susceptible to the evil eye. So when something bad happens to me, I worry it was caused by the evil eye. This question is technically about food, but it's really about caste, because very often high castes in India eat vegetarian food. And so I asked people basically, do you agree that as a Hindu you should only eat vegetarian food, or are you trying to model yourself off of the behavior of high castes or not? What Srinivas called Sanskritization. And then because the term dharma can sometimes just mean morality, I ask, can an atheist be a moral person? And so some people are like, if you believe in God, then you are a bad person. You can't be a good person. But for some people, they might say, yes, there are secular sources to morality, so that would be a sign of secularization. So there are lots of things I do with this survey data. I do like factor analysis, and I look at like the proponent box alpha to see the internal reliability of the scale. I develop a principal component index. For now, all that I'll do is just average the responses together. It's just kind of a very simple blunt measure. So this is what it looks like. So your score, because everything is 1 to 4, ranges from 1 to 4. So there are no purely secular people in the sample. No one who responded to every question in a secular way. But as you can see, as we might predict with secularization theory, most Hindus in a place that is a developing state come across as quite religious. You can see most of the scores are between 3 to 4, right? So this is just how the sample looks in terms of their religiosity. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but a little bit about the survey enumeration. So who did I talk to? How did I select my sample? So it's a multi-stage stratified random sample, and I think of 3 different stages of the survey process. So this is all about Bihar, right? So the state of North India. The first thing that I did was I wanted to stratify the state by different cultural regions. And that basically means where different dialects are spoken. So there's Bhojpuri, there's Magadhi, and Mathili. Those are 3 of the kind of cultural dialect regions. And so I randomly selected 1 district from each region just to show you what this looks like. So it's the state of Bihar. It's the size of Indiana with like 1/3 of the US population, if you want to think about that, okay? Also, when you stratify the state this way, you get a little bit more geographic breadth to your cases. So this is where the 3 districts are. Within each district, the first thing I do is I see what percentage of people live in census-designated urban areas, that is, towns or cities, and then rural areas, which basically means villages. And villages sometimes are grouped together by block. So let's just say that a particular district had 50-50. So I'm doing around 300 people in each district. So that would mean 50% in cities, towns, 50% in villages. But all of the data I have about where people live come from the 2011 census, and I assume that more people have been moving to cities since then because that's just, urbanization is occurring all over India. So I oversampled 10% from urban areas. So if the perfect split was 50-50, then I do 60% from urban areas and 40% from rural areas. In Bihar, almost all of the districts are overwhelmingly rural. So I didn't want like a 5% urban sample, so I would have increased that to 15%. Within each town, I picked a different neighborhood and I used an every 10 household method. So what that meant was basically you go to a neighborhood, and depending on the size of the sample you need, I would tell enumerators, go every 10 houses, knock on the door, see if it's a Hindu family, and try to do a survey there. And then if you can't, go to a house on the left or the right. Once you get that survey, count another 10 houses, and this is your kind of quadrant, right? Within villages, sometimes it would be every 20 houses or every 5 houses or whatever. Every locale is slightly different. That's the second level. And then the third level is within the household. So one problem I think that we have with surveys in India is very often household surveys means we're talking to the oldest man, and we don't get the views of younger people or women. So 50% of the sample is women. So I used a gender-bound survey team. So women interviewed women, men interviewed men. And basically what they do is they knock on the house and they say, is this a Hindu family? Sometimes you'll see like the crescent outside, so we'll know, okay, it's a Muslim family. Let's go to the next house. But assuming it's a Hindu house, let's say it's a female enumerator, she'll come in, she'll ask to speak to the oldest woman, like the wife or the grandmother, depending on who is kind of the female head of the house. And then she will say, how many women live in this house over the age of 18? So let's say she gets a response, there's 6 women. Some of the Bihari families are very big, like 14 people will live in a house. So let's say the grandmother says there's 6 women here over the age of 18. So then they use a random number generator app on their, everything is done via Android devices. And so they randomly select a number between 1 and 6. So let's say the number 3 comes up. So they'll say, can I speak to the third oldest person in the house? So that way, otherwise the sample is going to be just people in their like 50s and basically men. So this way you get a broader perspective. And like I said, everything is done, was done using Android devices, so that way it also minimizes any imputation errors or anything like that. Like I said, these are the 3 districts. So let me now get to the actual analysis that I did. So what I'm going to present today is just a very kind of first cut of the data. I'm still in the process of collecting data, and also cleaning up the data takes a very long time. But I'm just going to look at 3 very simple hypotheses and see what kind of results that we get. So secularization theory posits certain mechanisms, right? So one mechanism is education. A second mechanism is wealth or income. And then there are lots of studies that use this term personal security, which we can measure in lots of different ways. So we would expect all these things, observational research, so I can't necessarily tell you what's causing what, just from regression results alone. But we would expect that education is negatively correlated with religiosity. The more educated you are, the less religious you would be. I'm not saying I agree with that, I'm just saying this is what other scholars have theorized. I don't want to offend anyone. But we would expect the same results with wealth or personal security. Everything should be negatively correlated with religiosity. So I'll just show you very simple, I won't even show coefficients, but just very simple ordinary least squares regression analysis of everything in the data set. So education, I take the question directly from the National Election Study. So education can mean 0 can mean you have no education. Very often women in Bihar have no education. And then 7 is up to, like, I think, post-grad. You can see the average here is 2.68, so not a very educated sample. Income, I have personal income. I also ask about household income, and I also ask about assets that people own, because believe it or not, sometimes people lie about how much money they make. So instead I ask, do you have a radio, do you have a car, this kind of thing. And actually the measure of assets and income do not correlate very strongly, so there is actually quite a difference. But for now, I'll just use income, and I use the same buckets that you see from the National Election Study. So again, you could have no income, or the max amount on the NES survey. Income stability is just a question about whether your income varies from month to month. Okay, so if you have a salaried job, then it does not. But if you're like a farmer, then it could, depending on the harvest, other things like that. Lose a lot of observations here because women who have no income don't answer. They don't get asked the question, right? Because they don't have, their income is stable in the sense that it's zero, right? And then a self-reported measure of health. So the first 2, education and income, and the second 2 here are for personal security. How healthy are you? So I ask people to just rate their health on a 1 to 3 scale. You know, I also had other questions about, like, have you been to a hospital, or do you have any other kinds of diseases? But many of the villages have no hospital. Many of them don't have a medical clinic. So a lot of people just said, there's nowhere to go. I have to go to a different village. So for now, the best measure, I think, is just a self-reported measure. Control variables I include, so your age. The idea is people who are older, closer to the end of life, potentially might get more religious. So you might see an age effect here. Gender differences, and then I also ask about caste rank. That means, 1 means you're a member of a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. 2 means you are a member of an OBC, other backward class. And then 3 is just all forward castes. I also have everyone's individual caste, so you could do the analysis by caste group, but for now I'll just use this thing. So here's what it all comes down to. Okay, so the results of the analysis plus just means these things are positively correlated with your religiosity score. Negative means negatively related, and then the number of symbols means how strong the p-value, the strength of the association. So in this first set of models, the only thing that seems to consistently be negatively correlated with people's religion is how healthy they are. The healthier you are, the less religious you are. Education and income don't matter at all, which is kind of surprising. So there's really no differences between poorly educated and highly educated people, although again, there's not a tremendous amount of variation in the data. Some other questions that I asked about, how well do you speak English? That seems to be negatively related with how religious you are. Do you have internet at home? That means broadband. People in the village obviously do not, but some people in cities do have broadband internet connections. So you go on Google and type up the word atheist and you learn about atheism. Maybe it makes you less religious or something. So that has a negative effect. Having internet on your phone, that means a lot of people have flip phones or just kind of like the old Nokia phones. But if you have a smartphone, that seems to have an effect. If you have a non-Hindu neighbor, one idea is you move into a more diverse neighborhood. You learn about other religions. Maybe this makes you a little less sure about your religion. That seems to have some effect. Interestingly, owning a TV is positively related, and I would guess that's because there are just so many religious serials on TV in India. There are a lot of houses we went to during the survey where people are watching these soap operas that are about religious characters. So you'll see like Ganesh fighting someone on the screen and everyone's watching. So maybe that actually increases your religiosity or is positively related. And one kind of thing that I'm struggling to explain is that most of the time we assume women are more religious than men, but at least in this survey, it's men that being a man correlates with higher levels of religiosity. I don't know if the questions were like male-centric or men were more likely to respond in like pro-religious ways. But the big takeaway here is education and income don't really matter. The only thing that matters is health. Then when I include income stability, the health measure goes away, and that's the only measure that really matters. If your income is stable, you tend to be less religious, right? And some other things matter a little bit, English speaking and owning a smartphone. But again, strength of the, like the p-value there are not very high. Now, obviously the other question is like, what is the actual substantive effect? Not very strong. So here's what happens when you go from 1 to 3 in terms of your health score. Your religiosity will only decline from 3.6 to 3.4. So substantively doesn't have a lot of impact. So it is statistically significant, but not really substantively very important. Same thing for income stability. Just going from 0 to 1, you would only decrease your religiosity score from 3.3 to 3.15. So again, not a huge effect. So overall, not a tremendous amount of evidence for secularization happening, at least within this sample. I can't really talk about India as a whole, but at least for a developing state like Bihar, not a lot of evidence for secularization theory from my existing data. So the people who said secularization doesn't really work in India might have been onto something. So I'll conclude there just with a few broad points, and then happy to discuss all of this stuff with you. So first I would say that it's very annoying to hear about secularization mentioned as having an impact in lots of different countries, but not studied in a lot of different countries. There are many countries where we would expect to find some level of secularization, and we should maybe focus more on those countries. I don't want to make it seem like no one is studying secularization in India, but there are not a lot of scholars working on that. In order to do so, however, we can't just take the same measures that work in Abrahamic traditions. Do you believe in God? Do you go to synagogue? We need to develop new ways of thinking about. I focus on Hinduism, but I would say the same applies for if you want to study Buddhism in Southeast Asia. You will need different measures. If you want to study Shinto in Japan, you would need different measures. So I think we could study secularization in a universal way while recognizing religion means different things to different people in different countries. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. And then the main takeaway from my analysis is that most Hindus in Bihar are very religious. The only thing that seems to correlate with secular attitudes is personal security, but even there, the strength of the association is not very strong. So I don't find tremendous evidence for secularization